Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay, and you are listening to the New Discourses podcast. We're going to do a very long overdue episode today, and I have to start even with a mea culpa. It's a little bit embarrassing, as a lot of you know, some of you went. I did a workshop in Miami in October of, 2021. So a long time ago, 3 years ago, and it was called The Marxist Roots of DEI. And there was if you know what we're about to talk about, a glaring omission in my Marxist Roots of DEI workshop, which would, I think, be able to be boiled down to, I didn't know where DEI really came from, and now I do. In fact, I only recently became aware of where DEI really came from. Even with all these, I think, honestly, I've listened to some, even the older ones, great podcasts that I put out talking about how DEI works, about the Speak Bitterness campaigns, about the commissars, about all this. The true origin story of DEI actually goes to the Soviet Union. Big surprise, right? And the Marxist roots of DEI are in the Soviet Union. And Lenin, but even more, Stalin, are the fathers of DEI. So let's state that very clearly. Stalin is the father of DEI. DEI comes from the Soviet Union. It was a deliberate program that the Soviet Union used to achieve something that it called actual equality, something different than equality, say, under the law, or even equality of economics, equality of economic outcomes. Actual equality was true equality of all people in all ways. It was a very different idea. Now, of course, we use a different word for that. We call it equity today. And so we're going to set the record straight. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I'm afraid it's going to run long, as we often do. So I want to actually just jump into this podcast and talk about the DEI program, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program in the Soviet Union that was laid out primarily by Joseph Stalin and elaborated upon by Lenin and implemented by Lenin and Stalin together in the early 1920s. In fact, it lasted through most of the 1920s and had to be abandoned in the 1930s. Now, a lot of you are starting to see these articles that are coming out about businesses abandoning DEI here in America today and throughout the West. You're also seeing these articles about how a study has shown that DEI causes all these problems. Well, guess what? It did the same thing in the Soviet Union by the 1930s, at which point the Soviet policy switched on a dime, went exactly the other way. No more DEI. Now it's going to be crushed DEI. It's going to be all unity, all Soviet, all Russian. And it's, like I said, it switched on a dime because Stalin in the early 1930s, especially as the threat, the tensions that led to World War II started to ratchet up, he needed something completely different. Also, as he wanted to achieve his 5-year plan, he couldn't have all of this ethnic fighting that had broken out as a result of a decade of these DEI programs. So everything old is new again, and we're going through the same thing here. In the United States today. Why? Because we imported the Soviet DEI program basically minus the words exactly. And we've been implementing it full blast in our institutions for at least a decade. It's been the order of business since 2020, but it's actually been creeping into our business environment since at least 1970, arguably the mid-1960s, and poisoning how we do business. So this podcast is DEI in the Soviet Union, and we might throw the Russian word up there, I don't know, Korenizatsiya. Korenizatsiya. Not that I'm a Russian speaker. Spent a lot of time trying to practice so I can mispronounce these words for you anyway. But we're going to explore 4 important and interrelated concepts from the early Soviet Union today on the podcast. And the first of those is Korenizatsiya. And then the second one is called Raznubratsiya. And the third one is Faticheskoye Rawenstva, which I have a harder time saying that one because I haven't practiced very much. Faktichesko. So like Faktichesko. You get to go along with me as I try to figure out how to pronounce this word. Faticheskoye Rawenstva. And then the fourth term, I don't have it in Russian. It's just Great Russian Chauvinism, which was sometimes called Great Power Chauvinism. It was an object of a lot of theory in the early Soviet Union. And again, this almost all derives from Stalin. In fact, it derives from Stalin writing his kind of only piece of theory that he ever wrote, Marxist theory, which he wrote in Vienna in 1913. So if you've forgotten your history, the Soviet Union starts in 1917. So well before the Soviet Union kicks off, Lenin sends Stalin, not his favorite person in the world. Remember, Stalin was not a Russian. Stalin was a Georgian. So he was technically an ethnic minority against the Russians, whether that's under the Russian Tsar or whether that's under the Soviet Union later. So he sends Stalin, the Georgian, down to Austria to examine the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the way that Marxism is and is not taking there in the early 1910s. And so Stalin writes this long essay or pamphlet, I guess it gets described as, called Marxism and the National Question, because that was a real question in the Austrian region. You had Austrians, you had Hungarians, you had Czech, you had a variety of other ethnicities there, Slavs, and they did not all get along. And there was not one clearly defined national identity for this empire. As empires often are, they're kind of cobbled together. Maybe that's by definition, cobbled together from other nations. And so he was sent there to study that and to bring Marxist theory to bear on it, to make sense of it, which was going to be an important piece of understanding what to do in the similarly diverse, to use that word, to similarly diverse Russian or Soviet context as the Bolsheviks ended up taking power a few years later. So today we take these terms, Korenizatsiya, Raznobratsiya, Fakticheskoye Равенство, and those three terms anyway, we recognize those are DEI. That's the Russian DEI program, those three. Korenizatsiya could be taken to mean inclusion, although technically it doesn't mean inclusion. Raznobratsiya technically does mean diversity, and it is diversity the way that the woke use it, and Fakticheskoye Равенство means, if I'm saying that right, doesn't matter. What I mean by it is actual equality. We call that equity. And then you have this idea of Great Russian chauvinism, which is equivalent to privilege or supremacy. So some examples of that are the white supremacy culture we hear from CRT. That's the exact equivalent to Great Russian chauvinism. And then within queer theory, we have concepts like heteronormativity and transnormativity, which are the queer theory equivalents of great power or great Russian chauvinism. And everything just, as you say fancy in Latin, everything just imports mutatis mutandis, so making the necessary changes. So you just import the Russian program, and instead of dealing with how the Russians, being great Russians, you make it about white supremacists. You just import the Soviet program, and instead of making it about great Russians, you make it about heteronormativity. Everything imports and just transforms mutatis mutandis. Other math term would be that these are isomorphic structures, even if they don't use the same words and they don't have exact lineup in all of the way that everything's organized. Same exact idea. So we would mostly recognize Korenizatsiya as inclusion, though, like I said, that's imperfect because that's not what it means. And again, Raznobratsiya literally means diversity, directly translates and matches the concept of that program exactly. And then the hard one to say for me, because I haven't practiced, Fakticheskoye Равенство, literally means actual equality. That's the two words translate to actual equality, and we call that either equity or social justice today. So once you realize that, and maybe you just did, and we don't have to go any further for this part, it should really make the DEI scam we've been subjected to far more clear in terms of what it is and why it works or why it fails, and it should be much more upsetting. We imported a Soviet Union communist program directly and thought it was going to be a good idea. And I can rant about our very red-washed education, that we don't know what Korenizatsiya was. The Russians even covered it up, by the way. After Stalin canceled the program in the 1930s, they pretended they never did it. They covered it up. It only came out much later. Why? Because they didn't want people to know about it. Mao Zedong copied it exactly, and you would have had to have seen it in China, but of course they kept their inner workings secret as well. And so if we had education on how what the communists actually did, we would have been able to recognize DEI decades ago for what it was. And it never would have got out of these communist think tanks called the universities, because we would have recognized it for what it was and would have been able to call it out. We might even have been able to redirect the universities and all of these different consulting agencies and put the pressure on them to keep them from going in this direction. Now, I have to give a shout out of thanks on this. I have not studiously, but I've unfortunately largely avoided talking about Soviet Union. That, of course, I've been changing in the last few months. But up until now, even though it's the biggest and most obvious communist thing in the world, I focused my attention on the Western context, and I focused what I did with kind of classical communism on Mao and the Chinese or People's Republic of China context. And I more or less have not paid enough attention to the Eastern Bloc and, more importantly, Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc being largely its satellites. But fortunately, there's if I've got this right, a former teacher who is now driving trucks named Stephen Welliver, if I've got this right, in Washington State, who understands all this, knows all this, and has dug all this up and made it fairly clear on Twitter. So I encourage you to follow him and check his work out. He's very clear on talking about how the DEI program and most of the woke stuff has almost always a direct straight line that you can draw back to the Soviet Union. It doesn't matter what it is. So his name is Stephen Welliver, if I'm saying that right. Stephen is spelled with a V, Steven, and Welliver is Welliver, and his handle on Twitter or X is his name, Stephen Welliver. So you can go check him out and get more information about this. I'm going to try to publish some stuff from him. I've asked him to write some essays about these things. So hopefully we're going to get this story broken and make it clear for people. But what I'm going to do in this podcast, now that I've introduced the idea and I've told you about what it is, I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about how it works and the terms themselves. But I'm going to actually go through the two resources. There's actually more. We could go get more. But there are two resources from Stalin that are extremely important to laying out these ideas. So I want you to hear it in Stalin's own words, or at least as translated into English. The one is Marxism and the National Question from 1913, before the Soviets took power. And another one is his remarks at the 12th Party Congress, I should say, of Soviet Union from 1923. I will also drag Mao into this discussion because, like I said, the CCP actually imported this program directly, though with unique tweaks. And in fact, Mao was proud of the fact that he implemented it more successfully than Stalin and created racial harmony that Stalin was not able to create. So this was a bragging point for Mao. And obviously, we need to know about this because we're doing it to ourselves now under the brand names of things like DEI and social justice. So what are these terms? Korenizatsiya, the Soviet Union's affirmative action program. It would be best to actually, if we were going to generically translate Korenizatsiya based on what it does, we would call it affirmative action. That's not what the word means, but it was the Soviet Union's affirmative action program in the 1920s. And under the Korenizatsiya program, the Soviet Union got described as the world's first affirmative action empire. So that's from Martin, who actually analyzed this and talked about the Korenizatsiya circumstance and called it the world's first affirmative action empire. In other words, it's an empire built upon and held together by an affirmative action program. That affirmative action program in Russian was called Korenizatsiya. Korenizatsiya. It rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? It means nativization or indigenization, like to make native or to make indigenous, right? But the root word is neither native or indigenous. And Stephen Welliver told me earlier, actually today, that it was originally not called Korenizatsiya. It was called something like, I don't have it in front of me to get it right, but so I'll get it wrong. But it was basically nationalizatsiya, the Russian for national, so nation. Izatsiya, to make a nation, right? To make nations, nationification. But the word koreni in Russian means roots. And rootsification is, I think, my favorite way to translate that word. It is to dig into the roots and bring the roots up and out. But rootsification. Korenizatsiya, to get into the roots, where do the nations come from? Remember, it did come from Marxism and the national question. So Stalin was trying to answer what it means to be a nation and how national identities are relevant to a broader empire that's supposed to eventually transcend nationality and be internationalist in its circumstance. But because of his interest and his focus on this and some of his other traits, this is all what led the Korenizatsiya program is what led Lenin to start calling Stalin the National Socialist, because he was so interested in the national question and its relevance to figuring out how to run the Soviet Union, how to organize it. Now, I will just bring up that I don't think it's a coincidence at this point that there was I think it was a television series, I don't really remember actually, called Roots, that really, or it would be in Russian, it would be Koreni, that really inflamed a lot. I mean, again, I talk a lot about telling the truth falsely or being right wrongly, that told us, this is what critical race theory's bread and butter is to tell the horrors of history in a way that inflames ethnic conflict or any stratified conflict. The entire thing of Marxism is called a conflict theory. Society is divided into the haves and the have-nots, and the goal is to create conflict across that line of division. The Great Proletarian Uprising is a line of conflict between the proletarians and their bourgeois oppressors. And so calling it rootsification kind of has this second sort of relevance, I guess. But I want to deliberately pause to draw your attention here to how often woke Marxists in our day, for example, Kamala Harris, also talk about getting down to root causes. They're going to get to the root causes of whatever problem, and the root causes are not always just, well, they are always Marxist. I don't want to be grammatically confusing here. The root causes are always Marxist explanations for whatever's going on that demand Marxist solutions, but the root causes are very frequently identity politics that actually lead to the implementation of Korenizatsiya, rootsification. So what about Raznubratsiya? Raznubratsiya literally means diversity, but what it refers to is a dialectical conception of diversity. And I know I used everybody's least favorite D word, that if you don't understand, we can't really talk about this stuff well. But dialectical roughly means marrying a truth to a lie. There are three dialectics: quantity into quality and vice versa, the unification of opposites, and I'll think of the third one at some point. But the unification of opposites is the one that's key here. And what Raznobratsiya, which literally means diversity, refers to in a dialectical sense is what Lenin called unity of content through diversity of form. So in other words, it's unity achieved through diversity. So what you get that in practice is superficial diversity where everybody is unified as communists in their activity and intention. So does that make sense? So the Raznobratsiya program was literally to go highlight difference, so that's your diversity, in order to achieve unity in socialist thought. But the dialectic here is unity of content through diversity of form, which should feel very familiar for anybody who saw, say, Larry Elder get called the black face of white supremacy. I guess Kemi Badenoch in the UK, if I said her name right, Badenoch, I don't know, recently was put as the leader of the Conservative Party, and she got called the black face of white supremacy also there in the UK. Why? Because, as Ayanna Pressley said, we don't want any more black faces who don't want to be black voices. We don't want any more brown faces who don't want to be brown voices. And as Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project said, there's a difference between being racially black and politically black. In other words, when you have the authentic representation of your diverse ethnic heritage, you are speaking in unity with the voice of all who consider themselves oppressed. In other words, you're speaking with the great proletarian voice, and so you're a communist. And so unity through diversity refers to unity as socialists while manipulating the outward form of diversity and their issues in order to achieve it. And that's our diversity program. It's hard to talk about clearly what our diversity program is because it's dialectical. The goal is to do something impossible by mixing things that aren't true, by unifying opposites. Unity and diversity have to be unified, and you get that by getting different people who look differently and come from different backgrounds to all think and say the same thing. Finally, this faktycheskoye равенство is actual equality, and that refers to equality in all ways, not just economic, not just legal equality, and it's what we call equity or actually social justice. And what was all this program for? Well, we can turn back to Martin for that. And he said, already in 1916, Lenin stated that mankind can proceed toward the inevitable fusion of nations. So there's your unity through diversity. Mankind can proceed toward the inevitable fusion of nations only through a transitional period of the complete freedom of all oppressed nations. Stalin later explicated this paradox as follows: we are undertaking the maximum development of national culture so that it will exhaust itself completely and thereby create the base for the organization of international socialist culture. So the idea is we're going to make people be as Georgian, as Caucasian, as Tatar, as Ukrainian, whatever, as possible. We're going to maximize their national identity, national culture, as Stalin said, so that it will exhaust itself completely and thereby create the base for the organization of an internationalist socialist culture. And like Lenin said, mankind can proceed toward the inevitable fusion of nations. So he believed it was inevitable that we would be all under one gigantic Soviet republic. Mankind would proceed toward the inevitable fusion of nations only through a transitional period of the complete freedom of all oppressed nations. So you see the dialectical manipulation here built into Lenin's construction. They're going to go into various national identity groups. You're going to say they're oppressed by some outside force and that they're going to be made free under socialism because socialism believes in the true freedom of all oppressed nations. But the only way to actually get there is to be socialist. So they're going to get these minority ethnic nations to adopt socialist views and become pawns to a greater socialist imposition. In fact, the oppression of their nation is coming through socialism. Why? Because the iron law of projection never misses. So, like I said, the original outline for Korenizatsiya came from Stalin in 1913 in his theoretical pamphlet called Marxism and the National Question, which he wrote in Vienna after being sent there by Lenin to understand the Austro-Hungarian Marxists and how they were dealing with their multinational circumstance. Korenizatsiya did not actually get developed in 1913 or applied. It didn't start to get implemented until 1921 and had to undergo some major theoretical revisions, including by Lenin, as we just heard, in 1916. It became a key priority of the early USSR in 1921. So let's timeline this real quick. USSR comes into existence in 1917. Well, I shouldn't even say that. The USSR kind of comes into existence a little bit later. Lenin takes power and creates what will become the Soviet Union in 1917. By 1921, just 4 years later, Korenizatsiya became its nationalities policy or its national policy, which is not to say that it was its state policy. The state policy was that each of the individual member states are going to be maximally rutified, right? So then it was codified. The Korenizatsiya program was codified and implemented by Lenin and Stalin jointly and took full power in 1923 after the 12th Party Congress. And then by the early 1930s, they had to wind it down because it had all the same predictable effects that you would expect. Massive amounts of ethnic division, ethnic fighting, ethnic strife, massive tearing apart of social cohesion, just like any DEI program would create. And so what we need to do right now is understand this because of its enormous relevance for understanding everything woke, right? Not just CRT, which is obviously this, not just queer theory and so on, which are also folkish, by the way. It's all about their folkishness. We should probably talk about that for a second in a minute here. But it's also because this playbook is being run almost according to, like, to the letter in huge political arenas in large states with how do I want to say this? In states with large indigenous populations. Korenizatsiya is everywhere with CRT, queer theory, and so on, and the folkishness there, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is the playbook to take states that have large numbers of native populations and flip them to communism. What am I talking about? U.S. states like Alaska, Hawaii, the Dakotas, New Mexico, Arizona, with large native populations. The native populations are being treated on the reservations and so on to a Korenizatsiya style program in order to flip them against the United States, which is being claimed to impose a kind of U.S. chauvinism or Americanism on them that is not who they really are. And it did all these awful things in the past, and then it's forced them to do this, and it's to stir up their political resentment. And it's extremely effective in states like Alaska and Hawaii in particular, also to, like I said, lesser degrees in the Dakotas, New Mexico, Arizona. You also see it some in Oklahoma. You'll see it some in Kansas. You'll see it some in the upper Midwest. It's actually happened pretty significantly over the past decade, or past few decades in northern New York with the Iroquois, and bleeding into Canada. It is enormously relevant in states that are doing more of the indigenous thing than the CRT thing, like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, where this playbook has been being run to a T. It's also being run in a kind of a weird backwards way with Muslim populations in Europe. And actually, I should add, in Canada, where they are importing large populations of new natives, so to speak, and they're kind of running it in this weird upside down way. But what they are doing with those populations, with the liberating tolerance, with bringing in large numbers of them and giving them a different legal status and all of this stuff, is actually Korenizatsiya. So this playbook is being run across Europe. If we don't understand it and understand how it worked and why what it was used for in Soviet Union, and most importantly for my purposes, that it was Soviet communism. Its purpose is Soviet communism. If we don't understand that, then we're not going to react correctly to it. You are not being caring. You are not getting away from your racism or whatever it is you think you are by supporting a communist program developed in the Soviet Union to cause ethnic strife that will tear your country apart. You've got it all wrong, and you've got to understand that this isn't a question of, oh, well, we let them in and they're refugees, so we have to be kind. No, you're getting a playbook of a Soviet ethnic strife program run on your country, and it's called Korenizatsiya, and you can look it up and read about it and learn about its history, and learn about its effects, and learn about why Stalin had to crush it, which guess what they're going to do later when it achieves enough of power for them? They're going to turn around and crush it. The way that it works, though, is by stoking up national identity, ethnic identity, and saying, you are actually very important. So what we're going to do is make a lot of carve-outs for your ethnic identity, and we're not going to allow the great power, the existing nation, whether it's Britain, whether it's the United States, whatever, white supremacy culture, heteronormativity, we're not going to let the great power chauvinism force you to be how you aren't. We're going to let you be who you are. You can speak your own language. You can do your own traditions. You can have your own. And this all sounds really good. We're going to keep your culture alive. And then with stuff like LGBTQ and with stuff like critical race theory, the folkishness, I wrote about this in Race Marxism. There's a key aspect to it, this folkishness. They get people to see themselves as folk. In other words, as a ethnic nation. They want black folk versus white folk. Folk doesn't just mean people. Folk means something deeper. It goes back to folk. When I say folkish, I'm saying that in German. It is a belief about what constitutes an ethnicity or a nation, what makes a people and thus separate from other peoples. So it is already drawing lines around who is what and who is allowed to be what and how do these various so-called folkish cultures interact. Hitler's objective was to create the Aryan folk, the Volkswagen, or you say Volkswagen, right? The Volkswagen. The goal, that was the car for the folk. It was to create a people tied to a contingent place that were then going to be able to identify themselves as themselves and rise up. And this is happening also in the reaction here from the woke right in the United States today. But you have to understand that it's not a mistake that one of the flagship publications of the LGBTQ activist program is called LGBTQ Nation. This all goes back to the national question under Marxism as outlined by Stalin and implemented in the so-called Korenizatsiya program. And DEI taps into that. You have to get the diversity, Raznobratia, and you have to use it to make sure those people get put into positions as leaders or representatives or Soviets in the Soviet Union context, which is Korenizatsiya. You have to stoke up that national ethnic identity and fervor so that, as Stalin said, it will exhaust itself and give way to a socialist international belief or feeling or sentiment. And what you're going to do is you're going to get these native folk populations to believe themselves most readily identified as truly being socialist and being imposed upon by the greater outside force, the great power, the great Russian chauvinism, the white supremacy culture, heteronormativity, whatever it is. And like I said, with Native American reservations, you can hear this, how they talk, that they want you to assimilate. They want you to be American. They don't want you to continue your traditions. They don't want you to continue this. They don't want you can't speak your language. You have to speak English, blah, blah, blah. This is the goal. This is the play. And it comes from Stalin in the Soviet Union. And it was meant to basically, in practice, what it was designed to do was to create a lot of loyal commissars, Soviets actually, literally Soviets. So they would go to the ethnic minority groups and then force them to become socialists, and then put them into positions of power to force other people to adopt socialism. And the socialist would be the only ones who, like if you were a Georgian, you weren't a true Georgian unless you were speaking the socialist line. If you were a Tatar, you weren't speaking the true voice of the Tatar unless you were using the socialist line. And this is the same thing as our DEI program. You're not a true political black unless you're saying CRT. You're not a true queer unless you're spouting queer theory, so on and so forth. This is the program. So let's read through. That's the basic idea. I'm going to give some color here, but let's just read through a little bit of Stalin's Marxism and the National Question, which he wrote in 1913, where he outlines, this is widely considered to be the beginning of the Korenizatsiya program, and he outlines this model. I can say Korenizatsiya. Every time I say Korenizatsiya, and you're like, I don't remember what that Russian word means. It means DEI, is what it means. So we're going to start within Marxism and the National Question. I'm not going to read the whole thing. We're going to start from the end of chapter 2, where he's discussing nationalists themselves. This is actually a pretty fascinating short discussion that he gives on why Marxism, or really more Bolshevism, which is Lenin's model with a vanguard, is so adept at crushing nationalist movements and coalitions. So I bring this up. I put this on Twitter recently, and people get really upset about it. Nationalism is often given as the answer to this kind of country-hating, vile leftist Marxist stuff, but that's not actually correct. It's sort of a trap. The Marxists are really good at manipulating nationalism, especially because it's not at all clear what nation means. Some people use nation to be synonymous with country. Some people use it to be synonymous, therefore, with the state. Some people refer to the people within a country. Some people refer to a nation in the more narrow sense, LGBTQ nation, Cherokee nation, as a specific people with a specific ethnicity, with a specific view. And Stalin spends much of this document at the beginning talking about what it really means to be a nation. And the answer that he gives turns out to match the answer the Nazis gave later, the German folkish version. And this is why Lenin called Stalin the National Socialist, because he was so obsessed with this. And there's this kind of fascinating short discussion. But the answer to the hate your country messaging of the left is not nationalism, it's patriotism. And a lot of people don't have that clearly lined up in their head. They think that nationalism is patriotism and patriotism is nationalism, but no, they're not the same thing. Love of your country is patriotism. Nationalism is seeing yourself as a unique people, or at least historically, that's how it's been, and that's how Stalin used it, and that's how communists will, whether you think that that's the right definition of nationalism or not, let me promise you this. Communists use that definition of nationalism, and they will convince people that is the right definition of nationalism and use them against you. And which people am I talking about here? I'm talking about ethnic minorities. They will convince them that the nationalism doesn't include them. And it's a very simple manipulation, but it's extremely, extremely powerful. Communists are extremely good at going around and convincing members of minority groups to see themselves as a folk or as a nation, that the larger national or state entity, the Unity Project, pretends to include but actually exploits. It doesn't actually include them, and it doesn't want to include them fully. Soviet Union is plagued, Stalin would say, by Great Russian chauvinism. The Great Russian doesn't want Georgians or Caucasians or Ukrainians. He's a Russian. He doesn't like those people. He doesn't want Mongols. He doesn't want these people. And same with the Chinese. They just want your political power. They just want you to be there. These are the kinds of messages that are sold. The United States isn't really for everybody. Look at its history. It said it was for everybody, but it wasn't really for women or for black people or whatever else. And if you see yourself as a folk, as women, with folk leaders, feminists, or you see yourself as a folk, black people, with folk leaders, critical race theorists, then you can say, look, y'all are a people and you're an important people, and actually the country you live in doesn't respect you. It doesn't like you. It says that you're a part, but you've never really fully been a part, and they don't really want you to be a part, and they're exploiting you. That's all they want from you is political or economic or commercial exploitation. This is extremely effective agitprop. Remember, agitprop means agitation and propaganda, and Lenin said that the model was to send agitprop, agitation and propaganda, into all classes in society in order to create the necessary disruption. The Korenizatsiya program was an ethnic agitprop program. Remember, we call it DEI. It's an ethnic agitprop program designed to radicalize some members of minority groups who are then going to be held up as the official voices handpicked by the socialists because they are socialist. But then they will be located in the positionality of the minority group or the minority ethnicity or nation, aka that minority folk. And this is the construction that Stalin builds out about how national identity and the national question work. And there are lots of other points we'll draw out, but here's Stalin. He actually says social democracy, by the way, is the word for Bolshevism. It was before they called themselves the Bolshevik Party, starting in 1917, they called themselves the Social Democracy Party, the Social Democrat Party. So social democracy is communism. You have to pay attention. They rebrand all the time. So when they gain power, they become more clear. When they lose power, they become more vague. Social democracy is communism. He says social democracy in all countries therefore proclaims the right of nations to self-determination. So see, imagine that you are a minority ethnicity and you say, well, the broader country doesn't allow you to be you. You have to assimilate. You have to speak a language that's not yours. You have to send your kids to schools that aren't yours, blah, 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 right? You don't get to follow your own course. Like you were Navajo and now you're citizens of the United States, so now you have to do United States stuff. You don't get to carve your own, you don't get to decide how your life is going to be run. You're subject to U.S. laws and so on, right? And so they create reservations to kind of carve out space against that and so on, right? You see how it works. So he says social democracy in all countries, therefore communism in all countries, therefore proclaim the right of nations to self-determination. So they're saying the USA doesn't want you, or Russia doesn't want you to be yourselves, but the communists want you to be yourselves. We want you to be able to self-determine, and only communism, only social democracy really offers that. See how they kind of get them hooked? Well, it's easier, like, oh yeah, well, I like social democracy. Communism doesn't sound so bad. It actually cares about my issues. The irony, of course, is the iron law of woke projection never misses, and they are actually lying. They are the ones that are about to exploit you. He goes on and says, the right of self-determination means that only the nation itself has the right to determine its destiny, that no one has the right forcibly to interfere in the life of the nation, to destroy its schools and other institutions, to violate its habits and customs, to repress its language, or curtail its rights. So As always, the communists have a great sales pitch here. They're telling you something that sounds really good. You can hear how that agitprop is going to be attractive, at least to some members. Some members of the minority ethnicity or minority nation are going to notice that this is probably a baited hook. They see the bait, but they also see the hook. A lot, however, will see the bait and they will take it. And they're going to say socialism is actually for us. The Russians or the US or the Australians or whoever are actually oppressing us, and the socialists want us to be us. So I'm in. Guess which ones the Soviets are going to pick and put into power, not just up within their own government so they can have a more powerful power base in the national government or the national state, but also in your nation. They're going to become the governors who are going to keep all of the rest of the minority ethnicity on the plantation, so to speak, the socialist plantation, because we don't usually use that language, but all of socialism is a gigantic plantation program. The state owns one giant plantation and everybody works for it whether they like to or not. And so you can derive very quickly that in fact they are slaves of that state apparatus. As my friend Trevor Loudon says, communism isn't about helping people at all. It's about concentrating all of the power and all of the wealth in very few hands. And the way that you figure out who those hands are is that they are the willing lackeys of the leadership, the tyrants, the dictators of the communist program. And what we just read from Stalin is loaded with iron law of woke projection. It's happening heavy duty here because this is exactly how the woke Marxist diversity and inclusion program works in practice. Whether you call it Korenizatsiya or whether you call it DEI, doesn't matter. The communists come in and claim that they would never violate national or cultural sovereignty, that they alone do that, but their enemies actually impose forced assimilation and so on. And they use that as a wedge from the minorities against the prevailing majority. And they use that to stir up sentiment against the prevailing majority, which will then echo into useful idiots within that larger population. And more than that, they use it to curate a body of socialist activists within that minority who then claim to speak for that minority in order to get all those dynamics running even more strongly. But the fact is that the socialists actually require you, and we'll hear this from Stalin in a little while, they require you to have a critical or a socialist view of what it means to be a member of your minority group or nation or ethnicity. So they're actually imposing Marxism and socialism on those groups by selecting those representative voices and figures who are actually socialists and let them speak for the groups. So it's a complete inversion of reality. There is no self-determination. What Stalin says later, and Lenin is strong in agreement with him, is that it is, and actually most of the 12th Party Congress is actually in agreement. What they actually argue is that the big problem here is that if we make the national question too important, then what happens is we forget about the laborer question. In other words, the proletariat goes second to these ethnic minorities. So rather than focusing on the economic program of socialism, you now start focusing on all this side stuff, which is what our DEI program today really does, because they don't care about the economic equality part nearly as much anymore. So what we're getting is like raw Korenizatsiya without the subordination to the proletarian question. And in Soviet Union, they were very clear that no. It's not that way. The proletarian question comes first. The labor question is always first. And the resolution, which is concordant with what we face with DEI, the resolution is that the people who within these minority nations has it right because they're in line with the proletarian view. And so, in other words, they became socialists. So what does he mean by this fancy term, which is extremely important too, the right to self-determination? He's promising that no one else obviously gives, only the communists offer the right to self-determination. So when Stalin says the right to self-determination, as we're also going to see, what he means is that the various national identities, the minority nations, are going to be free to determine that they're socialist. And that they're actually, more importantly, that they are not represented by the broader nationalist project, which is oppressing them. And this is probably more clear if I talk about it, because it's a little bit historically murky with the beginning of the Soviet Union. But if we talk about it in terms of the People's Republic of China, it's actually a lot more clear, because the party that Mao took power from in his coup in 1949 in the Civil War, he took it from the Nationalist Party. The Kuomintang is what it was called. And so the Nationalist Party in China had tried to unify China under a single Chinese identity called Huarun. Run is person in Chinese. So Hua, I don't know if that means flower or whatever, something like that. But Huarun was meant to mean Chinese people and everybody in China. It didn't matter whether you were Han, whether you were Hmong, whether you were Cantonese or whatever. It didn't matter which ethnicity you were within China, and there were 56 of them identified. Everybody was Chinese people, Huarun. Everybody was the same under the nationalists. And what the CCP did was go around and tell people in the minority ethnicities, the 55 minority ethnicities, no, that's not true. They want you to be Han. There's Han chauvinism, great power chauvinism. The Han supremacy is coming in. Han chauvinism is coming in and forcing you. You want to identify as Chinese person, but all Chinese people have to be Han. So you have to adopt Han-ness, and you have to, like whiteness, and you have to live out a Han lifestyle because of Han supremacy. And of course, the Han people are supposed to feel Han guilt. They're supposed to feel guilty for forcing this, just like as Lenin and Stalin are very clear about. The great Russian is supposed to have contrition about being Russian and imposing his Russianness on the minority ethnicities. So when he says that there's going to be a right to self-determination, what he actually means is that these minority groups are free to determine that they're going to be socialist, and in particular not represented by the bigger nationalist project that would see them all as Chinese people or all as Russians. And so the narrative, like I said, that they use is that the nationalist project, by trying to make people be on equal footing within the greater nation, is in fact oppressing them. So they're saying that the definition of nation is artificial, that it applies to the whole country headed by one state, but there are lots of nations in the sense of folk inside of it. Nations as in ethnicities, ethno-nationalist groups. And in fact, that the broader nationalist project is crushing them and is oppressing them and failing to let them be who they are, because they have to be living up to this broader nationalist identity that everybody's going to assimilate to. And so the socialists are going to liberate them from that and allow them to self-determine their way against the nationalists and into socialism. But remember what Lenin said in 1916? It's a transitional period. It's just a transitional period. They promise this self-determination, but it's not to last. It's a baited hook. And a lot of people are going to bite it, and they become the activists. They become, in fact, governors. They become, and the right word is, they got brought in as Soviets. And they would be the Soviets over those nations, over those regions, or the Soviets that were placed into high-ranking government bodies placed throughout the Soviet Union. What was the purpose of them being in the big national government? Why would you put them there? Aren't they going to be a nuisance there with all of their grievance mongering? And the answer is yes, but they become invincible, because if any Russian complains about them, they're doing great Russian chauvinism. And so you have now various minority identities stuck into positions of power who can get away with the most awful and brutal stuff, and anybody who complains about it is just exhibiting a form of supremacy and is not to be taken seriously, and in fact is an oppressor who has the wrong values, who needs to be rounded up and put down. Isn't that a familiar phenomenon, right? This is how it works, and this was a intentional Soviet program, and we've been doing this intentional Soviet program for a while here in the U.S. now, arguably since 1971 with Griggs versus Duke Power in some sense, and it's not going well. And in college admissions, since Bakke versus the Board of Regents of the University of California system, that was in 1978. But yeah, you can self-determine your way into socialism. That's it. It's barely more subtle than that, but it is, I guess, a little more subtle. Stalin is really clear that groups or nations or folk will be allowed to self-determine roughly however they want, but it's a transitional period. And it's also going to be done with socialist guidance. And like I said, they use that to handpick the Soviets or the commissars. You can also be absolutely sure, and I'm sure a lot of them could be absolutely sure, what would happen if they actually rejected the socialist project, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The whole point of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to crush their enemies. So we saw that in the 1930s when being Ukrainian was no longer cool because Stalin ended the Korenizatsiya program and he crushed Ukraine in the Holodomor, absolutely destroyed independent Ukrainian identity in the Ukrainian kulak. Ukraine was no longer self-determining after the Holodomor in the 1930s. Very poignant case in point. So this was all, like I said, a bait and switch or a baited hook and an evil program. As we continue, let's read some more Stalin explaining this about the self-determination. He says, this, of course, does not mean that social democracy, which means communism, will support every custom. Oh, you can't just do whatever you want. We're going to self-determine, but you can't quite self-determine. This does not mean that social democracy will support every custom and institution of a nation. While combating the coercion of any nation, it will uphold only the right of the nation itself to determine its own destiny, at the same time agitating against harmful customs and institutions of that nation in order to enable the toiling strata, that's the proletariat, of the nation to emancipate themselves from them. The right of self-determination means that a nation may arrange its life in the way it wishes. It has the right to arrange its life on the basis of autonomy. It has the right to enter into federal relations with other nations. It has the right to complete secession. Nations are sovereign and all nations have equal rights. This, of course, he says, does not mean that social democracy, which means communism, will support every demand of a nation. A nation has the right even to return to the old order of things, but this does not mean that social democracy will subscribe to such a decision if taken by some institution of a particular nation. The obligations of social democracy, which is communism, which defends the interests of the proletariat and the rights of a nation, which consists of various classes, are two different things. Yeah, so if you don't want to do it, or they're not going to go along with you, and you might just have to go along back to the old ways, or you might secede or whatever else, at which point they're going to crush you. That's the whole thing. So really, you kind of have to, you're not really self-determining. It's like every other Marxist lie. You're self-determining by doing what you're told. As long as what you're told is against the existing power that the communists are actually trying to fight, which in that case would have been the old guard Russians. So if they can turn all these other minority nations against the Russian, they can use them in order to consolidate their own power and eventually, like Stalin proved in the Holodomor in 1930s, turn around and crush those minority nations and bring them in line. Continuing a little bit more with Stalin, he says, in fighting for the right of nations to self-determination, the aim of social democracy, which means communism, the aim of communism is to put an end to the policy of national oppression, to render it impossible, and thereby remove the grounds of strife between nations, to take the edge off that strife and reduce it to a minimum. So the goal is to put an end to the policy of national oppression. By whom? Who's oppressing these minority nations? They're coming in and saying, hi, we're socialists, we're the communists, we're the social democrats. We are not going to oppress you like the great Russian does. So the whole point is actually to stir up hatred of the majority population by these minority nations that they lead to see themselves as folk. In other words, the key here is to stoke these minority populations, minority ethnicities, to fight for the right of nations to self-determine outside of the existing national project to the benefit of the socialist power grab. In Gramscian terms, if we fast forward to Western Marxism, the key is to generate a counter-hegemonic force or multiple counter-hegemonic forces that ideally would be socialist, but they don't have to be socialist. This is why they're willing to use Muslims who are not socialist. They are religio-fascist. They're religious fascists who are coming in to Europe. This is why they're willing to use people who are not actually communist, because what they need in the Korenizatsiya program are counter-hegemonic forces that will undermine the existing so-called great power. Ideally, they'd be socialist, but they can be whatever they want. They can self-determine so long as they break up the nationalist project. These Muslims who are being used by the socialists, it'll be a war because they're going to fight like hell for themselves, but these Muslims who've been brought into Europe they think they're going to take over Europe and maybe they'll get to run it for a little while. But the fact of the matter is the communists have bigger plans. Unless some of this stuff has just been sold basically at auction by the communists to the Muslim powers, they're going to face the attempted crushing eventually, because you're allowed to self-determine so long as you're a problem for the existing so-called great power. That's the freaking key concept, great power chauvinism. And as long as you're a problem for the existing great power to the socialist advantage, you're allowed to do whatever you want. But if you start threatening the socialist project, by God, you're getting smashed. And you got to understand that that's how these people work. And so DEI really shouldn't stand for, I mean, this is cutesy or whatever. It shouldn't stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It should stand for divide et impera, or divide and conquer, as one translation in Latin. So later, these minority nations might become socialists, and if they do, they'll be brought into the fold. If not, they're going to be crushed as an external enemy after their usefulness as a counter-hegemonic force is used up. This is the theory. This is how Korenizatsiya works. And in fact, this is, like I said, exactly what Stalin did in the late 1920s and going into the early 1930s as he wound down the Korenizatsiya program in the USSR, as suddenly there was a need for strong national unity in order to complete his 5-year plans as a single Soviet Russian people. What a big surprise. In the process, Korenizatsiya generated huge ethnic conflict that was actually tearing apart at the edges of the Soviet Union. But it was also very useful for Soviet Union for the various reasons I've already said. Eventually, the ethnic conflict in these minority states became too much of a problem, so Stalin had to cancel his DEI program, which had lost its usefulness, and it immediately didn't just get canceled, it got reversed. And there was plenty of pain, asked the Ukrainians, brought to the people who didn't want to go along with this sudden reversal. So under the communists, when they have power, by the way, self-determination is as long as they are extracting use from you. It is an exploitative relationship. The second you stop being useful to them, they will end you. They will turn on you. They will destroy you. Stalin went on to say, a little further down, he said, this is what essentially distinguishes the policy of the class-conscious proletariat from the policy of the bourgeoisie, which attempts to aggravate and fan the national struggle and to prolong and sharpen the national movement. And that is why the class-conscious proletariat cannot rally under the national flag of the bourgeoisie. So do you get it yet? Yeah, that's fine. You can go be your own nation, but you cannot rally under the bourgeois national flag. So you're going to have to adopt the socialism. So the standard trick is being employed. Nations can do whatever they want, obviously, I guess. But they need to understand that the bourgeoisie has created various policies, propaganda, efforts to contain the rebellion, all to its own benefit. So what they're going to do is they're going to come along and say, the bourgeoisie is already using your nation. So we need to resist that. Do you get it? They're exploiting you. They need you to be like them. They're exploiting you. It's a straight up standard iron law of Oak projection trick. If the nations are going to want to truly self-determine, the first step that they have to do is throw off that national bourgeoisie. So now you have to fight the class enemies of the socialists in order to take the first step to your own liberation as a nation. Then you can self-determine. But look, you're already doing socialist stuff and you're fighting the bourgeoisie and adopting class consciousness. And your fight actually against your own national bourgeoisie begins through class consciousness and taking up proletarian solidarity. And the more of that you have, the more the proletarians will help you because you're now in solidarity with them. So you're turning these people into communists to fight their own national bourgeoisie based on lies so that you can actually become vassal states and useful tools to the socialist state. This is how DEI works, by the way. The bourgeoisie, unlike the social democrats who are the communists or the Bolsheviks, the national bourgeoisie are actually said to be the ones attempting to aggravate and fan the national struggle and to prolong and sharpen the national movement. So all this conflict that you're having to deal with, it's really the bourgeoisie's fault. It's that, again, externalize blame onto your class enemies and stir up resentment and hatred. It's the classic hate-craft maneuver. And Stalin's conclusion with that is that such people, the ethnic minorities, in order to self-determine correctly, quote, cannot rally under the national flag, which it will position as actually being the flag of the bourgeoisie. So that means you have to break away and become a counter-hegemonic force, like I said. And when you are a counter-hegemonic force, you're going to also want to take up as much solidarity with the proletarian as you can. And that is technically self-determination. So let's go on with a little bit more Stalin to really firm up that point. He says, the fate of a national movement, which is essentially a bourgeois movement, is naturally bound up with the fate of the bourgeoisie. See how, you're supposed to be, if you're in the ethnic minority, you're now supposed to be against their national bourgeois elements, and you're supposed to fight in solidarity with the proletariat. But it turns out that the national movement in your national bourgeoisie was essentially bourgeois in the first place, and it's bound up with the fate of the bourgeoisie, so it's the bad guys. And he says the final disappearance of a national movement is possible only with the downfall of the bourgeoisie. Maybe that's a little abstract for you. Let me, I'll go back and reread this whole thing from the beginning, but let me clear this up. The final disappearance of a national movement is possible only with the downfall of the bourgeoisie, right? So imagine going to, let's say, a Navajo or an Inuit or something like this, or a native Hawaiian, and saying, look, here's the problem. There is a United States that's imposed itself upon you. And that's ultimately this bourgeois phenomenon, right? That's a national project of class enemies who want to control and exploit you. And the fate of the movement here, say in Hawaii, is naturally bound up with the fate of that movement overall of the United States. So the final disappearance of the this imposition, I should say, on Native Hawaiians, the final disappearance of a national movement is possible only with the downfall of the bourgeoisie, right? The final disappearance of this imposition on Native Hawaiians is possible only with the downfall of America. Doesn't that sound like things that you might hear today? That's because it's the same program. So he says the fate of a national movement, which is essentially a bourgeois movement, is naturally bound up with the fate of the bourgeoisie. The final disappearance of a national movement is possible only with the downfall of the bourgeoisie. Only under the reign of socialism can peace be fully established. So there's your punctuation mark on the whole thing. You can self-determine, but you're only going to have peace when you're socialists. No justice, no peace, right? They'll never give you peace, actually, but that's not how the sales pitch goes. But even within the framework of capitalism, they say, it is possible to reduce the national struggle to a minimum, to undermine it at the root, to render it as harmless as possible to the proletariat. This is borne out, for example, by Switzerland and America. It requires that the country should be democratized and the nations be given the opportunity of free development. So Stalin hasn't even introduced the idea of Korenizatsiya here, but he's made the essential argument for how it's going to work and how it's a powerful weapon to use anywhere a nationalist sentiment or national unity exists. This country's not really for you. That's a bourgeois belief, a bourgeois project. And the only way for us to actually get you to be who you are authentically, to live your true life, to bring your whole self to work, is to collapse the entire country, the entire nation, the entire national project. As we slide down into chapter 3, Stalin picks up, he says, a nation has the right to freely determine its own destiny. It has the right to arrange its life as it sees fit, without, of course, trampling on the rights of other nations. That is beyond dispute. But how exactly should it arrange its own life? What forms should its future constitution take if the interests of the majority of the nation and, above all, of the proletariat are to be borne in mind? So he's sitting here wondering, in other words, if the social democrats, which is to say the communists, should be putting a thumb on the scale, or should they present definite plans to transform these minority nations? And he's trying to work this out. So he's saying, let's ask ourselves, what are these countries, what are these micronations, or what are these ethno-states going to look like within the broader, say, union? How should they do it? And of course, the interests of the majority of that nation, which for communists, the proletariat are always the majority, and above all, the proletariat more broadly, are to be borne in mind. And he says, he's sitting here for the rest of this chapter saying, well, should the communists put a thumb on the scale, present definite plans, and make it happen? And then he goes on to mock people who either say yes or who take laissez-faire approaches, because you need a dialectical answer because it's communism, right? So people who say yes, the communists should put a thumb on the scale, he says, no, you're just imposing the same problem that you're trying to defeat. And then the people who say, no, let's let them be laissez-faire, let them determine their own course. He says, though, those people fail to understand the relevant historical conditions, and he explicitly says that it's a dialectical approach that's needed. Why? Because he's a Marxist, and if you don't understand dialectics, then you don't understand anything, which means what you're going to do is make up some crap that claims to be somewhere in the middle or in between, that unifies the opposites, but that in fact is just some kind of very ad hoc program that allows the communists to have the power to implement what they need to implement where they implement it. He says, the economic, political, and cultural conditions of a given nation constitute the only key to the question how a particular nation ought to arrange its life and what forms its future constitution ought to take. It is possible that a specific solution of the question will be required for each nation. If the dialectical approach to a question is required anywhere, it is required here in the national question. So in case you wondered, no, Stalin very clearly said dialectical. It will be a dialectical approach. He reiterates the point as he gets close to the end of the third chapter. He says to repeat the concrete historical conditions as the starting point and the dialectical presentation of the question as the only correct way of presenting it. Such is the key to solving the national question. In other words, how can you make unity out of diversity? How can you get to unity of content given diversity of form? And in fact, the goal is to figure out a way to amplify diversity of form so that they can make use of it. And I already told you how. Anybody who criticizes the diversity is a great Russian chauvinist who has to be silenced or arrested or shut down or re-educated in order that they can end up with unity of content in the socialist program. And a lot further down in this, I'm just kind of skipping around here until we get to the really meaty part. I'm just kind of setting the table technically still. After discussing a variety of different solutions that have been attempted in different places, including in the Caucasus, Stalin writes this. He says, the national question in the Caucasus can be solved only by drawing the belated nations and nationalities into the common stream of a higher culture. It is the only progressive solution and the only solution acceptable to social democracy, which is, of course, communism. So that's the dialectic, guys. There's a higher culture, which is the socialist road as it was put in China. Are we going to take the feudal road? Are we going to take the capitalist road? Are we going to take the socialist road? And what he's saying is that the only way to solve the national question is by drawing the nations and nationalities into the common stream of some higher culture, which, what do you think they think higher culture is? Socialism. That's right. And so much for self-determination. So by the time we get down into chapter 6, near the end of it, after lots of various arguments with imaginary foes, Stalin says this. Now that we now know that he's not actually interested in self-determination, there's going to be a stream of a higher culture that they're all actually going to be subjected to. In other words, they're all going to have to veer towards socialism. Here's what he says. After all this high-minded talk about how socialists and social democracy is the only one that supports self-determination for these minority nations, he also says the only progressive solution and the only solution acceptable to social democracy is to put them all in the stream of a higher culture, meaning communism. Here's what he has to say a few chapters later. Nations have a right to arrange their affairs as they please. They have a right to preserve any of their national institutions, whether beneficial or harmful. Nobody can and nobody has a right to forcibly interfere in the life of a nation. But that does not mean that social democracy will not combat and agitate against the harmful institutions of nations and against the inexpedient demands of nations. On the contrary, it is the duty of social democracy to conduct such agitation and to endeavor to influence the will of nations so that the nations may arrange their affairs in the way that will best correspond to the interests of the proletariat. For this reason, social democracy, while fighting for the right of nations to self-determination, will at the same time agitate, for instance, against the secession of the Tatars or against the cultural national autonomy for the Caucasian nations, for both, while not contradicting the rights of these nations, do contradict the precise meaning of the program, that is, the interests of the Caucasian proletariat. So what this means is, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. And I'm not really joking. He's saying you can be black however you want. But if you go against social democracy, you're not really doing it. You're not actually understanding, and you are in fact contradicting the precise meaning of the program, which are the interests of the, in this case, it would be woke black proletariat. Do you understand? You're allowed to self-determine so long as you self-determine in agreement with the woke program. That's DEI. You're allowed to be black however you want as long as you're woke politically black. You're allowed to be gay however you want as long as you're woke politically queer. You're allowed to be a woman however you want as long as you are a woke feminist. Do you get it? This is it. This is unity in content through diversity in form. The through part means that what they're going to do is use you as a human shield so that when you go out and propose the most egregious communist crap in the role of power that they gave you as an officer of some kind or as a diversity hire in the government, like Admiral Richard Levine or whoever else, when you put it out, if anybody criticizes you, now it's actually a criticism of that ethnic population with you by proxy. And they have a shield by which they can implement their programs. That's what that means. If you decide to be black or gay or female or whatever on your own terms, you contradict the precise meaning of the program, which is the interests of the woke in that identity category, and you'll get called the black face of white supremacy. You'll get called a gender traitor. You'll get called all kinds of other names. This is Korenizatsiya. So that is the socialist and Soviet thumb is going to be on the scales, even though they say it's not. The self-determination scale is going to be weighted heavily to you becoming a socialist in the Soviet mold. And by the end of this document, as we get further down through it, Stalin never gives a solid description of what the full answer to the national question is, but that's typical of this communist stuff. Why is it typical? Because if he gives a definitive answer, if they're clear about anything, then they lose latitude. They have to do what they wrote down to some degree, or they might get held to account. Technically, they're tyrants, so they don't, but they tried to do that. So if they leave the program vague, and Mao was like the master of this, if they leave the program vague, that gives them the latitude to do whatever they want, to do however they need to in order to arrange the thing to crush their class enemies much more effectively. But by the end of this document, even though he never gives a clear answer, all he ends up saying is that it has a lot to do with so-called regional autonomy or kind of regionalism. And I'll tell you what he says about it here in a second, but I want to talk about this regionalism for a second separately, because that is one of the big globalist scams that we're facing today. The goal is actually going to be to break apart existing great power nations and to create factionalized, balkanized regions that cross state and national borders so that the laws and the meaning of those political entities, existing political entities, become nullified. So you want a folk that's partly in Tennessee, partly in Mississippi, so that it's, for example, it self-identifies that way, but how is it going to be governed by Tennessee law, Mississippi law, or its own law? And you want regions, the Redoubt movement out in the Northwest is part of this. You want regions that cross borders to nullify the power of established law and the political entities themselves, the existing so-called great powers, so that they can break things apart and they get the people inside, of course, to define themselves in ways that are fruitful for the necessary conflicts that they have. This is an extremely important globalist plot nobody ever talks about, the regionalism project. What does Stalin have to say about this? He says, what then is the way out? So he's trying to figure out the solution to the national question, which he never actually gives. The only correct solution is regional autonomy. Autonomy for such crystallized units as Poland, Lithuania, the Ukraine, the Caucasus, etc. The advantage of regional autonomy consists, first of all, in the fact that it does not deal with a fiction bereft of territory, but with a definite population inhabiting a definite territory. Next, it does not divide people according to nations. It does not strengthen national barriers. On the contrary, it breaks down these barriers and unites the population in such a manner as to open the way for division of a different kind, division according to classes. See, so they want people to start seeing themselves as proletarian versus bourgeois in each of these national ethnic environments. They don't want people to see themselves as Georgian or as which is what it sounds like. You're allowed to be Georgian people how you're going to be. They don't want people to see themselves as some member of a Caucasian group or tribe. They want people to see themselves increasingly in communist terms and class identities. And the goal of this program is to break down those borders. In other words, in modern terms, you could be black, you could be gay, you could be whatever, you could be a woman. All forms of oppression are the same. So you have to have solidarity across according to classes and your positionality within those classes. It has nothing to do with each one of the little folk enclaves that they've built up and said they get to self-determine. You can't be black and not support LGBTQ because all forms of oppression are the same, so you have to. You can't be black and not support feminism because all forms of oppression are the same, so you have to. In other words, they're shifting out of, they're using your national identity, there's these folkish identities, and amplifying them as a conduit to getting people to see themselves in terms of socialist identity classes and the conflict therein. For Stalin, that was bourgeois versus proletariat. For us, it's a little bit different. It's woke versus not woke, really, or woke versus reality. Finally, Stalin says it makes it possible to utilize the natural wealth of the region. In other words, rob that region, exploit that region. It's going to go take all of its natural resources, food, and so on, like in Ukraine with the food. But in our time with DEI, we get to mine cultural capital. You get to go, we are like woke, so we get to do black stuff or whatever, right? So it makes it possible to utilize the natural wealth of the region and develop its productive forces in the best possible way without awaiting the decisions of a common center, functions which are not inherent features of cultural national autonomy, which is one of his enemy ideas that he puts forth. That's another dialectical solution. Thus, he says, but he rejects it because he doesn't want cultural autonomy. He wants everybody to become socialist. Thus, he says, regional autonomy is an essential element in the solution of the national question. Of course, not one of the regions constitutes a compact, homogeneous nation. Oh, how about that? They cross borders. Not one of the regions constitutes a compact, homogeneous nation, for each is interspersed with national minorities. Such are the Jews in Poland, the Lets in Lithuania, and the Russians in the Caucasus, the Poles in the Ukraine, and so on. It may be feared, therefore, that the minorities will be oppressed by the national majorities. But there will be grounds for fear only if the old order continues to prevail in the country. Give the country complete democracy, that means communism, and all grounds for fear will vanish. It is proposed to bind the dispersed minorities into a single national union. But what the minorities want is not an artificial union, but real rights in the localities they inhabit. What can such a union give them without a complete democratization? So what he just said here is they don't want a big fake nation union where we all get along. They want their own rights where they are as who they are, right? And if you were to have some grand union, what would it be able to do? Well, nothing unless it was completely democratized, in other words, made communist. On the other hand, he says, what need is there for a national union when there is complete democratization? So you see, you might not even want a big, national force telling you who you have to be. So we're not even going to have that. We're just going to fight for complete democratization. In other words, we're going to fight for our democracy as it is today through DEI. In other words, we're going to fight for communism. What is it that particularly agitates a national minority? Stalin asks. He says a minority is discontented not because there is no national union, but because it does not enjoy the right to use its native language. Permit it to use its native language, and the discontent will pass of itself. A minority is discontented not because there is no artificial union, but because it does not possess its own schools. Give it its own schools, and all grounds for discontent will disappear. A minority is discontented not because there is no national union, but because it does not enjoy liberty of conscience, religious liberty, liberty of movement, etc. Give it these liberties, and it will cease to be discontented. Thus, equal rights of nations in all forms, language, schools, etc., is an essential element in the solution of the national question, aka Korenizatsiya. Consequently, a state law based on complete democratization of the country is required, prohibiting all national privileges without exception and every kind of disability or restriction on the rights of national minorities. That and that alone is the real, not a paper guarantee of the rights of a minority. In other words, you set up a program where they get to speak their own languages in their own places, have their own schools, be completely separatist, see themselves as a separate nation, but it's also going to have to be to fight for the complete democratization or socialism. And anybody who disagrees, anybody who doesn't like that this actually turns into that last part, prohibiting all national privileges without exception and every kind of disability or restriction on the rights of national minorities, prohibiting every kind of disability or restriction. Imagine what that might include. That's an affirmative action program, right? That is what they're going to do. They're going to set up a huge entitlement program, and they're going to create a situation where anybody who disagrees with it is racist or chauvinistic or something bad. And they're going to use that to advance the cause of socialism. And isn't that how our DEI programs work? Because that's what our DEI programs are, Korenizatsiya. So that was all I'm going to read from the 1913 piece. I mean, it's not super long. I encourage you all to go read it. I'll have it in the links. But in 1923, Stalin in the 12th Party Congress identifies 3 primary challenges outside of practical economic questions that are hindering the development of the USSR. And this is where they really implement Korenizatsiya. And the 3 major problems he identifies are 1, Great Russian chauvinism, which we would understand as a white supremacy culture, for example, or heteronormativity, which demands inclusion to overcome. He didn't say inclusion, I'm just telling you it does. The second is actual inequality, which is in English today inequity, which of course demands equity to answer it. And then the third is what he called local chauvinism, which would be non-socialist understandings of a minority ethnicity and reverse racism, particularly reverse racism. Local chauvinism would be reverse racism. And what this actually demands is a smart diversity program, which is the Korenizatsiya programming that he built into the thing. Remember, Korenizatsiya means diversity, and it means unity in content through diversity in form. And this was a major deal at the 12th Party Congress in Soviet Union. So it was a major part of the intentional government mandate in Soviet Union in the 1920s under the leadership of Lenin, and then after Lenin died in 1926 under the leadership of Stalin, until it all fell apart and they needed national unity. And so Stalin had started killing all the ethnic minorities. So at the 12th Party Congress, one of Stalin's comrade rivals, Nikolai Bukharin, stated, "We, the ethnic Russians, as a former great power nation, must put ourselves in an unequal position." This should sound a lot like the whole whiteness culture thing, because this is where we're going to talk about white supremacy culture, aka Great Russian chauvinism, is the first of these problems. We, ethnic Russians, as a former great power nation, must put ourselves in an unequal position, he said. Only with such a policy, when we artificially put ourselves in a position lower than others, only at this price can we buy the trust of formerly oppressed nations. So that's at the 12th Party Congress in the Soviet Union in 1923, Nikolai Bukharin speaking, Comrade Bukharin. We must only by putting ourselves artificially in a position lower than others, meaning Russians being the we, ethnic Russians, only at this price can we buy the trust of formerly oppressed nations. Now, Nikolai Bukharin Comrade Bukharin sounds exactly like Robin DiAngelo, exactly like Ibram Kendi. Why? Because it's the same damn message, right? We have to artificially lower ourselves as Russians and uphold the ethnic minorities. Only at this price can we buy the trust of the formerly oppressed nations. And here's what Stalin has to say about it, although this isn't as punchy. He says, what is the class essence of the national question? So we've got class, right? That's the proletarian question, but then we have the national question. That's a different form of inequality. Under the present conditions of Soviet development, the class essence of the national question lies in the establishment of correct mutual relations between the proletariat of the former dominant nation and the peasantry of the formerly oppressed nationalities. Here, in the national sphere, we are concerned with establishing correct mutual relations between the proletariat of the former dominant nation, which is the most cultured section of the proletariat in our entire federation, and the peasantry, mainly of the formerly oppressed nationalities. Okay, so the proletariat Russian is supposed to go and find affinity with the peasantry of the formerly oppressed nationality, with the minority group. Remember how clever we all thought Herbert Marcuse was when he explained that they would radicalize the university students? So those become your Russian proletariats, and that they're going to go minister to the oppressed minorities and the ghetto populations like racial minorities, sexual minorities, feminists, and so on. There are your peasantry of the formerly oppressed nationalities. And so that model actually was from Stalin, and that model was part of Korenizatsiya. So he says this is the class essence of the national question. In other words, the people who should be teaching the underclass in the ethnic minority groups so that they will rise up and throw off the bourgeois leadership, the people that are doing that are supposed to be Russians who are already Soviets or communists, the proletariat. They're awakened communists. So the Russian communist is supposed to go teach them, but the only way they can do so is by doing all this crap about how we have so much Russian chauvinism, we're worse than you, blah, 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 let's make up for you. And then you raise up this ethnic minority peasantry to become a vanguard force or a revolutionary force that will overthrow the existing bourgeois power structure within the national this particular ethno-national circumstance, which will then become a wedge to then wield against the entire country. It says if the proletariat succeeds in establishing with the peasantry of the other nationalities relations that can eradicate all remnants of mistrust toward everything Russian, a mistrust implanted and fostered for decades by the policy of Tsarism, so the thing that we just left behind and defeated in the revolution, that evil, that bad evil, Mao did this too, always blamed everything on the Kuomintang for the rest of his life. The bad old ways made all of this mess that we have to clean up. So if we can overcome that with our basically being woke, we're bad, we're Russians, we're bad. If we can overcome that, then we might be able to do something good, he says. We might be able to solve the national question. He says, if, moreover, the Russian proletariat succeeds in establishing complete mutual understanding and confidence in effecting a genuine alliance, not only between the proletariat and the Russian peasantry, but also between the proletariat and peasantry of the formerly oppressed nationalities, the problem will be solved. To achieve this, the proletarian power must become as dear to the peasantry of the other nationalities as it is to the Russian peasantry. And in order that Soviet power may become dear also to the peasants of these nationalities, it must be understood by these peasants, it must function in their native languages, the schools and the governmental bodies must be staffed with local people who know the language, habits, customs, and manner of life of the non-Russian nationalities. Does that sound like self-determination anymore? You get to have your own schools. This is the only way. You get to have your own language. This is the only way. By the way, we're going to make sure it's filled with people who speak your language and speak your values and go to your schools and teach socialism. That's the only way, it says, so that Soviet power may become dear to the peasants of these nationalities. It's like I said, the students radicalized in universities going and ministering communism to the so-called ghetto populations, right? That's the whole idea. Where did I leave off here? Sorry. Soviet power, he says, which until very recently was Russian power, will become a power which is not merely Russian, but international. Notice it's not merely Russian, so it's still Russian, but it's also international, dialectical. It's two things at once. A power dear to the peasants of the formerly oppressed nationalities only when and to the degree that institutions and governmental bodies in the republics of these countries begin to speak and function in the native languages. But there are also factors which hinder, which impede this union. Why would they be so focused on the native languages? Partly to butter them up and partly to create this line of division where there's this disconnect and distrust back to the Russian that they're trying to operate against. He says, but there are also factors which hinder, which impede this union. The principal force impeding the union of the republics into a single union is that force which I have said is growing in our country under conditions of the new economic policy. I'm not going to get into what the new economic policy is, but it's a big deal. It's called Great Russian Chauvinism, Stalin says. It is by no means accidental, comrades. You may talk about Bolshevism as much as you like. You may prate as much as you like about your internationalist tendencies, but we know that you will achieve what Denikin failed to achieve, that you Bolsheviks have resurrected, or at all events will resurrect, the idea of a great Russia. All of that is not accidental. All of that is not accidental, nor is it accidental that this idea has even penetrated some of our party institutions. So he's saying, what you're trying to do is you're saying, oh, we're the great Soviet Union now, and you're just resurrecting what was the Russian equivalent of white supremacy culture. We're better than everybody else, and we're going to impose it on everybody. So he wants there to be a dialectic between the ethnicities. He wants the Russians to see themselves with Great Russian guilt. He wants the ethnic minorities to blame the Great Russians for their problems. He's all been stoking that. It's the exact same program we see in DEI now. And he says all of this is not accidental. And in fact, it's even penetrated into the party, which means we're going to have to do a DEI in the government. Doesn't that sound like what we have from our government? White supremacy culture, heteronormativity, transnormativity is all penetrated deep within our government. We have that battle playing out in Congress right now as I record this between Representative Nancy Mace and the newly elected Representative Tim, a.k.a. Sarah McBride, who claims to be a trans, aka a man wearing a dress. And we have that fight happening right now in our party institutions. So the goal is to create that conflict that's going to allow them to bring in more of the socialist programming. And they need that conflict to be waged by people believing that their ethnic identity is important enough to where it can't be trampled by the existing great power identity. This is how Korenizatsiya works. He says at the February plenum, where the question of a second chamber was first raised, a second chamber in the government, make a whole new department of the government, right? A second chamber was raised. I witnessed how certain members of the Central Committee made speeches which were inconsistent with communism, speeches which had nothing in common with internationalism. All this is a sign of the times, an epidemic. So that might be like Nancy Mace speaking up and saying that men can't be women. All of this is a sign of the times, he says, an epidemic. The chief danger that arises from this is that owing to the new economic policy, dominant nations' chauvinism is growing in our country by leaps and bounds. Just imagine, owing to the Green New Deal, white supremacy culture is growing in our country by leaps and bounds. You can hear these. This is an exact echo of what we deal with day in and day out today. Striving to obliterate all that is not Russian, striving to obliterate all that's not white, to gather all the threads of government into the hands of Russians or white people, and to stifle everything that is not Russian or white or straight or heteronormative or cis-normative or whatever. The chief danger is that with such a policy, we run the risk that the Russian proletarians, which would be the good whites, will lose the confidence of the formerly oppressed nations, which they won in the October days, when they overthrew the landlords and the Russian capitalists, when they smashed the chains of national oppression within Russia, withdrew the troops from Persia and Mongolia, proclaimed the independence of Finland and Armenia, and in general put the national question on an entirely new basis. Unless we arm ourselves against this new, I repeat, great Russian chauvinism, which is advancing, creeping, insinuating itself drop by drop into the eyes and ears of our officials and step by step corrupting them, we may lose down to the last shreds the confidence we earned at that time. You could imagine him saying Kamala's line about we're not going back at this point, right? It is this danger, comrades, that we must defeat at all costs, he says instead. Otherwise, we are threatened with the prospect of losing the confidence of the workers and peasants of the formerly oppressed peoples. We are threatened with this prospect of a rupture of the ties between these peoples and the Russian proletariat, and this threatens us with the danger of a crack being formed in the system of our dictatorship. That's Stalin. He says it must be understood that if a force like Great Russian chauvinism blossoms and spreads, remember, every time you hear Great Russian chauvinism, that's white supremacy culture in our world, or heteronormativity, or cis-heteronormativity. It must be understood that if a force like Great Russian chauvinism blossoms and spreads, there will be no confidence on the part of the formerly oppressed peoples. We shall have no cooperation within a single union, and we will have no union of republics, aka USSR. Such is the first and most dangerous factor that is impeding the union of the peoples and republics into a single union. That's what Great Russian Chauvinism is about, although really a lot more could be said. But I think it's patently obvious that he's talking about Great Russian Chauvinism in exactly the same way that we hear about white supremacy culture, and he's saying it is the number one threat to a union, a successful union. So when you hear somebody say white supremacy culture is the number one threat to our democracy, they are channeling Stalin. They are saying exactly Stalin's things. And of course, it's the implementation of the Korenizatsiya program that they're actually referring to. So next up, we hear his number 2 issue, which is inequity. Inequity is literally what he calls actual inequality. Inequity is actually considered the second great impediment. It sounds just like stuff today because this program, Korenizatsiya, was the DEI program. And so equity becomes central. Achieving or forcing equity becomes central to the broader Korenizatsiya program, just like our DEI stuff today. Stalin called it actual equality instead of equity, which was fakticheskiego равенство. I can't say that. Равенство. I still can't pronounce my Russian letters. I apologize. So here's what he says about actual inequality, or aka inequity. He says let me be clear just one more time. Actual equality refers to equality in all dimensions, not just legal equality or juridical equality, but also economic equality and also social equality in every possible way. That's hence why you have this Great Russian Chauvinism being such a big problem, is that even if you got everything else equal, you still have these people believing that they're Great Russians and therefore better than the other minority nationalities. So he says, we have proclaimed juridical equality and are practicing it. So 4 years into the Soviet Union, or 6 years in at this point, I guess it's 23. 6 years into the Soviet Union, they have proclaimed juridical equality and are practicing it. Of course, we all know that that's not what was happening. The class enemies had no equality, but everybody who was a Soviet, I guess, was okay. But he says, but juridical equality, although in itself of very great importance in the history of the development of the Soviet republics, is still very far from being actual equality. When he says juridical, well, that means legal equality. Okay, so even having that, he says, very far away from actual equality. Okay, it's from equity. Formally, he says, all the backward nationalities and all the peoples enjoy just as many rights as are enjoyed by the other more advanced nations which constitute our federation, the backwards people, right? The ghetto populations, right? But the trouble is that some nationalities have no proletarians of their own, have not undergone industrial development, have not even started on this road, are terribly backward culturally, and are entirely unable to take advantage of the rights granted them by the revolution. This, comrades, is far more important a question than that of the schools. Some of our comrades here think that the knot can be cut by putting the question of schools and language in the forefront. That's what he said so far. But that is not so, comrades, he says. Schools will not carry you very far. These schools are developing, so are the languages, but the actual inequality remains the basis of all the discontent and friction. Schools and language will not settle the matter. What is needed is real, systematic, sincere, and genuine proletarian assistance on our part to the laboring masses of the culturally and economically backwards nationalities. In other words, equity, aka affirmative action. Right? Affirmative action. What is needed is real, systematic, sincere, and genuine proletarian assistance on our part to the laboring masses of the culturally and economically backwards nationalities. Assistance, affirmative action, to achieve equity. In addition to schools and language, the Russian proletariat must take all measures to create in the border regions and the culturally backwards republics. And they are not backwards because of any fault of their own, but because they were formerly regarded as sources of raw materials. They must take all measures to ensure the building of centers of industry in these republics, like black-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, gay-owned businesses. Oh, it's the same. It's the same. And I want to remind you, in case it slipped your mind, that I am reading Joseph Stalin, talking about how to organize the Soviet Union. I am not talking about your guy, except that I am, in your HR department down at your work making you do this crap, except I am. It's Joseph Stalin laying out this program. And so what he wants is for Russian workers to go build factories while giving all forms of other assistance, while lowering themselves in all social and cultural ways, and prostrating themselves before the ethnic minorities, but to go build factories. So why do they want to build factories? Well, it's not to exploit them for their natural resources like the Tsar did. Ooh, that's not it. No, they want to go build them factories, not to exploit them for their labor. Yes, that's actually what it is. But actually, so these people can have factories to work in, so they can become workers, so they can become proletarians and thus be indoctrinated into Marxism through the experience of working in factories. So Stalin is like, oh no, we're bad. We've hurt you so much. We need to industrialize your backwards region. And as they industrialize it with their contaminated schools and everything else, they are going to teach them to be proletarians. They're going to teach them to be socialist workers, to join the socialist workers' parties. This is all being done in parallel to the ambition in the West today to have higher education, indoctrinate the ghetto populations, like I already said, to turn them into revolutionary forces. So, these parallels, I mean, this isn't a coincidence, guys. This is a direct import of the Stalin program into the United States and other Western countries. And we should be freaking out that we've done this to ourselves, that we are this many years in to a deliberate implementation of a Stalinist program that we've been running on ourselves for almost as long as that Stalinist program ran in the Soviet Union before it collapsed and it blew up on itself. Bear in mind that only Soviets had any say in any of the Soviet republics, so only peasants who would become Soviets through this whole process, in other words, communist councilmen, would have any control over what's really happening. Everybody else is going to be oppressed, just like they're going to be class enemies. They're not part of the people. They're not going to be treated as citizens. No one wants to hear what they have to say. They're going to be oppressed and excluded from and suppressed everything. They're going to be lose their right to vote, lose their right to property, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, this is similar to, although more brutal, in the ways that non-DEI compliant racial and sexual minorities or non-feminist women get treated by Western Marxist theories today. They don't count. They're the black face of white supremacy. They have internalized racism or sexism. They're gender traitors, they're race traitors, and so on. But there's a third factor Stalin wants us to know. He says, but there is still a third factor that is impeding the union of the republics into a single union, the existence of nationalism in the individual republics. Remember before, when they were talking in 1916, Lenin and then Stalin shortly after, and they were saying that they were going to maximize the national identity to let it exhaust itself, and that was a transitional period. Transition is getting to be close to over, because now they're talking about, oh crap, we now have we encourage nationalism in the individual republics, and now we have nationalism in the individual republics. And he says the new economic policy affects not only Russian, but also the non-Russian population. The new economic policy is developing private trade and industry not only in the center of Russia, but also in the individual republics. Of course, if there were no great Russian chauvinism, which is aggressive because it is strong, because it was also strong previously and has retained the habit of oppressing and humiliating. Remember, this is supposed to be like white supremacy culture. If there were no great Russian chauvinism, then perhaps local chauvinism also, as a retaliation to great Russian chauvinism, would only exist in a much reduced form, in miniature, so to speak, because in the final analysis, anti-Russian nationalism is a form of defense, an ugly form of defense against great Russian nationalism, against great Russian chauvinism. That was a really long sentence, but let me tell you what it means. The only reason there's reverse racism is because of white supremacy. So the racial minorities, black people, should not be being reverse racist, but they are. But it's actually justified because it's a defense against this much worse systemically empowered racism. In other words, real racism is prejudice. It's not just prejudice, it's prejudice plus power. See? So that's the exact same theory. This is what Stalin just said. If this nationalism were only defensive, it might not be worth making a fuss about. He said, but it's actually, so it's not that big of a deal. But they're like, oh no, it's kind of out of our hands. We could concentrate the entire force of our activities, the entire force of our struggle against great Russian chauvinism in the hope that as soon as this powerful enemy is overcome, the anti-Russian nationalism will be overcome with it. For I repeat, in the last analysis, this nationalism is a reaction to great Russian nationalism, a retaliation to it, a certain form of defense. Yes, that would be so if anti-Russian nationalism in the localities were nothing more than a reaction to great Russian nationalism. But the trouble is that in some republics, this defensive nationalism is turning into aggressive nationalism. Okay, so he's saying, well, if we could defeat white supremacy culture, a lot of this would have went away, but oops, we've encouraged the national question for far too long. They were talking about it in 1916. Here it is by 1923. They're like, oh no, we've encouraged nationalism in the various republics, and now they're actually just being racist. Like reverse racism actually happened. And what he's calling local chauvinism is reverse racism that was primarily stoked by the Korenizatsiya policies that they put. And then he says, whoops, but most of it's actually to be blamed on great Russian chauvinism and white supremacy culture, and this is what's actually caused it to start going too far. Then he gives several examples of what it looks like in the various regions, but what he concludes is all of this leads to conflict and weakens the Soviet regime. This is a prelude to him smashing these people later, by the way. This tendency toward local chauvinism must also be cut off at the root. What he's doing here is justifying a pretext to be able to govern the groups that he said would be self-determining. Of course, compared with great Russian chauvinism, so you always bring up the white supremacy culture as the specter to make everything that they want to do okay. Of course, compared to great Russian chauvinism, which in the general scheme of the national question comprises 3/4 of the whole, local chauvinism is not so important. But for local work, for the local people, for the peaceful development of the national republics themselves, this chauvinism is a matter of first-rate importance. See, so what communists almost always do is they want you to react in a particular way, but they don't want you to go too far because then they lose their power over you. If you actually had national determination and you could be as nationalist as you want, that would be no good. So they have to say, wait. There are, as Mao put it, there are not just left deviation or right deviations, there are also left deviations. You can go too far right, but you can go too far left, and we have to make sure that we stay on the middle path. This is a very, very common power grab. So they hand this autonomy, this false autonomy to the ethnic minorities under Korenizatsiya, which is Soviet DEI. And they hand them this power, and then they say, wait, there's a limit, and we still have control. And he goes on to say, I pass to an examination of the ways and means by which we must eliminate these 3 main factors that are hindering union. Great Russian chauvinism, actual inequality of the nations, and local nationalism, particularly when it's growing into chauvinism. So great Russian chauvinism, aka white supremacy culture, inequity, and reverse racism are the 3 main hindrances to unity, he says. Of the means that may help us painlessly to rid ourselves of this heritage of the past, which is hindering peoples from coming together, I shall mention 3. The first means is to adopt all measures to make the Soviet regime understood and loved in the republics, to make the Soviet regime not only Russian but international. For this, it is necessary that not only the schools but all institutions and all bodies, both party and Soviet, should step by step be made national in character, hence him being called the National Socialist, that they should be conducted in the language that is understood by the masses, that they should function in conditions that correspond to the manner of life of the given nation. Only on this condition will we be able to convert the Soviet regime from a Russian into an international one, understood by and near and dear to the laboring masses of all the republics, particularly those which are economically and culturally backwards. The second means that can help us in painlessly getting rid of the heritage from Tsarism and the bourgeoisie is to construct the commissariats of the Union of Republics in such a way as to enable at least the principal nationalities to have their people on the collegiums. In other words, an inclusion program. We're going to include the minority ethnicities onto the commissariats, and to create a situation in which the needs and requirements of the individual republics will be met without fail. The third means it is necessary to have among our supreme central organs one that will serve to express the needs and requirements of all the republics and nationalities without exception. So you're going to have to create a new central organ to the Soviet Union that's actually going to be dedicated to DEI. You need a national DEI office. And he says, I especially want to draw your attention to this last means, he says. If within the Central Executive Committee of the Union we could create two chambers having equal powers, one of which would be elected at the Union Congress of Soviets, irrespective of nationality, and the other by the republics and national regions, the republics being equally represented and the national regions also being equally represented, and endorsed by the same Congress of Soviets of the Union of Republics, I think that then our supreme institutions would express not only the class interests of all working people without exception, but also purely national needs. We would have an organ which would represent the special interests of the nationalities, peoples, and races inhabiting the Union of Republics. Doesn't this sound like DEI, guys? Under the conditions prevailing in our Union, which as a whole unites not less than 140 million people, of whom 65 million are non-Russians, in such a country it is impossible to govern unless we have with us, here in Moscow, in the supreme organ, emissaries of these nationalities. There's your inclusion program. To express not only the interests common to the proletariat as a whole, but also special specific national interests. Also, there's your diversity program. Without this, it will be impossible to govern, comrades. Unless we have this barometer and people capable of formulating these special needs of the individual nationalities, it will be impossible to govern. That is the Soviet system of government. It is called Soviet power, people's power. Because remember, Soviet means council, it doesn't mean people. It is called Soviet power, people's power, because relying on the common people, it is the first to register any change. It takes the appropriate measures and rectifies the line in time. If it has become distorted, criticizes itself and rectifies the line. This system of government is the Soviet system, and it requires that the system of our higher agencies should include agencies expressing absolutely all national needs and requirements. National needs does not mean of the overarching Soviet Union, it means of these minority ethnicities. So there's a definite inclusion program that is connected through the diversity program, so a DEI program that's running this. And it will be the Soviets who run everything. It's called Soviet power, chosen and trained through the diversity program, Korenizatsiya, and the Russification and inclusion program called Korenizatsiya that we're talking about here. And that's what's going to constitute this new second chamber of the government, co-equal to the Chamber of Soviets. It will be people from among the minority nationalities who express interests common to the proletariat as a whole in addition to their specific national interests. So socialists from Nation X posing as the true representatives of Nation X to be welcomed as a part of the relevant ruling Soviets. It's important to realize that these programs got exported from the Soviet Union. They didn't. What started in the Soviet Union did not stay there. Even after it failed, even after they had to reverse all of it and cover it up, starting about a decade later, and roughly the same time period that this was happening in the 1930s, really a little bit later, 1920s. It has to be the 1920s. So at the same time as this was happening in the Soviet Union, it was happening in the United States, and this was documented by the former communist Manning Johnson. And they were trying to do Korenizatsiya to the United States by trying to get blacks to recognize themselves as a distinct, separate Southern nation. Okay, so there was a Korenizatsiya program being brought in by the Communist Party USA and through Soviet influence into the United States to try to get the Southern blacks to form their own nation and split the United States. And like I said, Manning Johnson's talked about this, and other people have documented this as well. In fact, we might only have been saved as a nation because this might have very well been successful. The black nationalist or separatist project was extremely potent, but it was a communist plot. We might only have been saved by the Great Depression, believe it or not, because the Great Depression forced large amounts of people from the South to move north, including lots of black people who moved to the northern cities, to get to the northern factories so they could get a job. And that actually it created actual diversity, as it turns out, in all these different locations, which frustrated the attempt to create a separate black nation in one geographical location. Now, we didn't go through Stalin's definition of a nation on this, but Stalin's definition of a nation requires geographical continuity. Therefore, you need a people in a place. Well, if the people that you have now scattered in a kind of work-based diaspora, you don't have a people in a place anymore, and you have a problem. And they didn't have a solution ready to deal with that. Korenizatsiya was also taken up explicitly and in full by Mao Zedong in the CCP in the 1920s and used in the later 1920s and then 30s, and then periodically afterwards in China. As a matter of fact, it's still used today. But it was first used by Mao in the CCP to destabilize the nationalists, the Kuomintang, like I already explained to you guys earlier. And then later it was used to gin up agitation periodically that let Mao and the CCP consolidate power off the back of the various ethnic minorities and peasant groups through the 1950s in particular, early 1950s, 53 to 56. And then in 56, Mao declared victory. Like I said, it's still used up to this day. In China, it was used heavily by Deng Xiaoping after Mao left power, by dying. I don't know exactly Xi Jinping's stance on it, but I'm sure that Han chauvinism is still something that has to be criticized. The Korenizatsiya program has been documented, was imported. The nationalities program or nationalities policy was imported directly from Stalin. It was the Korenizatsiya program. And it went after the idea of the Kuomintang nationality and then eventually Han chauvinism. So in 1963, on March 16th, 1963, in an intra-party directive, Mao issued a document, a short document, 2 paragraphs, called Criticize Han Chauvinism. And it's the exact same program. He says, in some places, the relations between nationalities are far from normal. For communists, this is an intolerable situation. We must go to the root and criticize the Han chauvinist ideas, remember, just say white supremacy, which exist to a serious degree among many party members and cadres, namely the reactionary ideas of the landlord class and the bourgeoisie, or the ideas characteristic of the Kuomintang, which are manifested in the relations between nationalities. Mistakes in this respect must be corrected at once. It's exactly what Stalin did too, and they're using it for the same purposes, in this case, largely to shore up power within both regions and also within his own party. Delegations, he said, led by comrades who are familiar with our nationality policy. That's Korenizatsiya. That's documented that's exactly what it was. Comrades who are familiar with our nationality policy and full sympathy for our minority nationality compatriots still suffering from discrimination should be sent to visit the areas where there are minority nationalities, to make serious effort at investigation and study and help the party and government organizations in these localities discover and solve problems. The visits should not be those of, quote, looking at flowers on horseback. So you're going to have to go get involved with the people, do the work. Very similar. You're not going to go by and observe from a distance and all that. You have to get involved. He says, judging from the mass of information on hand, the Central Committee holds that wherever there are minority nationalities the general rule is that there are problems calling for solution, and in some cases, very serious ones. On the surface, all is quiet, but actually there are some very serious problems. What has come to light in various places in the last 2 or 3 years shows that Han chauvinism exists almost everywhere. It will be very dangerous if we fail now to give timely education and resolutely overcome Han chauvinism in the party and among the people. The problem in the relations between the nationalities, which reveals itself in the party and among the people in many places, is the existence of Han chauvinism to such a serious degree and not just a matter of its vestiges. In other words, bourgeois ideas dominate the minds of those comrades and people who have had no Marxist education and have not grasped the nationality policy of the Central Committee, which again is Korenizatsiya, Soviet DEI. Therefore, education must be assiduously carried out so that this problem can be solved step by step. Moreover, the newspaper should publish more articles based on specific facts to criticize Han chauvinism openly and educate party members and the people. So it was Han instead of white, but the whole white supremacy culture program that we've seen from our government and our media was run by Mao Zedong in the 1950s. And the CCP's, or People's Republic of China's, official nationality policy, like I said, was imported directly from Stalin, which is where he got it. Mao was a student of Stalin. They had issues, but he was a student of Stalin, and it was Korenizatsiya, using Stalin's definitions of nation and every other thing in the national question itself. Indeed, if you actually look, the CCP and the People's Republic of China explicitly imported their model based on Stalin's 1913 work, Marxism and the National Question, but also the directive of the 1923 12th Party Congress. So 3 years later, in 1956, Mao considered the Defeat Han Chauvinism or Criticize Han Chauvinism campaign to have been successful, and it became the basis of one of the so-called 10 major relationships that the CCP put out to brag about how good it was about creating equality and harmony through communism and socialism in China. The real way it created the appearance of harmony was that it purged everybody who wasn't very harmonious. And he issued the 10 major relationships bragging point in a speech that he gave in 1956. Now, this is a very interesting year, right? So Stalin dies in 1953, which is roughly when he pushes this big program. But then Stalin gets denounced by Khrushchev in 1956, and then all of the communist countries in the world, China included, had to do a big de-Stalinization program. And you had to figure out ways to make yourself look better than Stalin and not as awful as Stalin and superior to Stalin and separate from Stalin. And so Mao put out a lot of that stuff, and the 10 major relationships thing likely could have been seen as part of that. Because Mao would have seen him declaring victory in the ethnic minority question or the nationalities policy as assuming bragging rights over Stalin. He adopted Stalin's program. Stalin couldn't do it, had to reverse course in the 1930s, killed a bunch of people, and the rivalry then is settled. Mao is better than Stalin because Mao was able to successfully implement Chinese Korenizatsiya where Stalin had failed in Soviet Union. And this Stalinist and Maoist understanding of the nationalities question, from what I understand, is still in use in China to this day. Xi Jinping definitely sees the matter similarly. So if we return back to Stalin, we can hear a little bit more from this 12th Party Congress. This is a Congress, right? So what I'm reading here are not writings, they're speeches. And I mean, I've read them, but they were speeches given. And so Stalin spoke, then other people spoke, including, as we already heard, Nikolai Bukharin. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. Bukharin, and then other people spoke, and then Stalin spoke again. So after allowing others to have their turn to speak at the 12th Party Congress, many of them actually alleged that Stalin cares too much about the national question and forgets the primary issue, which is the working class, the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the proletarian question. So Stalin has to respond. And this is going to sound kind of like the debates between various kinds of woke, or the Marxists versus the woke really today. And the wokes, kind of like Stalin, are using a more developed dialectical position, so they keep winning. Which is basically, no, we're going to have both at the same time in a way that doesn't make any sense, but I'm the leader and I dare you to question me. In particular, what Stalin starts to appeal to is higher rights. So before it was that there was a stream of higher culture, and now he's going to talk about higher rights that are going to settle the national question while keeping his Korenizatsiya program as Soviet policy. He says it's clear to us as communists that the basis of all of our work lies in strengthening the power of the workers, and that only after we are confronted by the other question, a very important one but subordinate to the first, namely the national question, we are told that we must not offend the non-Russian nationalities. That is perfectly true. So we can't offend the minorities, right? That is perfectly true. I agree that we must not offend them, but to evolve, we must not offend them, but to evolve out of this a new theory to affect the great Russian proletariat must be placed in a position of inequality in relation to the formerly oppressed nations is absurd. It is clear, he says, that the political basis of the dictatorship of the proletariat is primarily and chiefly the central industrial regions, not the border regions, which are peasant countries. If we exaggerate the importance of the peasant border regions to the detriment of the proletarian districts, it may result in a crack in the system of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is dangerous, comrades. We must not exaggerate things in politics, just as we must not underrate them. It should be borne in mind that in addition to the right of nations to self-determination, there is also the right of the working class to consolidate its power. And now we're at the crux, right? The dictatorship of the proletariat, the Communist Party, will not be questioned. So it must be borne in mind that in addition to the rights of the nations to self-determination, there is also the right of the working class to consolidate its power, and the right of self-determination is subordinate to this latter right. There are cases when the right of self-determination conflicts with another, a higher right, the right of the working class that has come to power to consolidate its power. Hear that? In such cases, this must be said bluntly. The right of self-determination, wonder where that's about to go, right? The right of self-determination, that's what it's all about. This must be said bluntly, he said. The right of self-determination cannot and must not serve as an obstacle to the working class in exercising its right to dictatorship. The former must yield to the latter. That was the case in 1920, for instance, when in order to defend working class power, we were obliged to march on Warsaw. It must therefore not be forgotten when handing out all sorts of promises to the non-Russian nationalities, when bowing and scraping before the representatives of these nationalities, as certain comrades have done at the present Congress. It must be borne in mind that, in our external and internal situation, the sphere of action of the national question and limits of its jurisdiction, so to speak, are restricted by the sphere of action and jurisdiction of the labor question as the most fundamental question. So, remember, Korenizatsiya was sold to these people as providing the minority ethnicities and nations with the full right to self-determination, which the great Russian, whether czarist or communist, sought to deny them. But self-determination is to be understood as obviously and necessarily subordinate to the labor question, that is, to the dictatorship of the proletariat and its indisputable power, plus its power to consolidate its own power. That is, the national question must be subordinate to communism itself. So all of this national affirmative action only counts when you're communist. How then would you imagine that any of the minority ethnic or national so-called Soviets would be chosen by their connection or their fealty to communism? That's how. So another objection Stalin gets with all the bowing and the scraping he was referring is that a lot of the representatives say, well, we shouldn't fight the local chauvinism, the reverse racism at all. And here's how he answers about that. He says, the fact of the matter is that Bukharin has failed to understand the essence of the national question. When it is said that the fight against great Russian chauvinism must be made the cornerstone of the national question, the intention is to indicate the duties of the Russian communist. It implies that it is the duty of the Russian communist himself to combat Russian chauvinism. If the struggle against Russian chauvinism were undertaken not by the Russian, but by the Turkestanian or the Georgian communists, it would be interpreted as anti-Russian chauvinism. That would confuse the whole issue and strengthen great Russian chauvinism. Only the Russian communists can undertake this fight against great Russian chauvinism and carry it through to the end. What does that sound like? The white people have to fight the white culture, the white supremacy culture. The straight people have to fight heteronormativity. Cis people, so to speak, that don't exist, have to fight cis heteronormativity and transphobia. Men have to get into the fight to subordinate patriarchy. That's where he's arguing there. And he says, and what is intended when a struggle against local chauvinism is proposed? The intention is to point to the duty of the local communists, the duty of the non-Russian communists to combat their own chauvinists. Can the existence of deviations toward anti-Russian chauvinism be denied? Why, the whole Congress has seen for itself that local chauvinism exists, Georgian, Bashkir, and other chauvinism, and that it must be combated. Russian communists cannot combat Tatar, Georgian, or Bashkir chauvinism. If a Russian communist were to undertake the difficult task of combating Tatar or Georgian chauvinism, it would be regarded as a fight waged by a great Russian chauvinist against the Tatars or the Georgians. That would confuse the whole issue. So if they were to fight the other kinds of reverse racism, then they're being racist, and everybody would be confused. Only the Tatar, the Georgian, and other communists can fight Tatar, Georgian, and other chauvinisms. Only Georgian communists can successfully combat Georgian nationalism or chauvinism. Oh, so the only people who can do it right in the Georgian context are Georgian communists. Do you understand? It goes for all the rest, too. That is the duty of the non-Russian communists. That is why it is necessary to refer in these theses to the double task. That of Russian communists, I refer to the fight against Great Russian chauvinism, and that of the non-Russian communists, I refer to the fight against their anti-Armenian, anti-Tatar, anti-Russian chauvinism. Otherwise, these theses will be one-sided. There will be no internationalism, whether in state or party affairs. So doesn't all this sound familiar? The Great Russian, or in our case, white people, have to be the ones to fight the Great Russian chauvinism, aka white supremacy culture, because otherwise it will be interpreted as local chauvinism, aka reverse racism, or racism against reverse racism, and destroy solidarity. Therefore, also, the minority ethnicities and nationalities must fight their own local chauvinism, but they can only do that by adopting the communist line. They have to adopt the overarching internationalist Soviet or socialist solidarity program. And it is them who must fight. So who do you think that the Soviets are going to help? So you have this problem Stalin identifies of local chauvinism, and you want to make sure the communists come out in the power struggles in those local nationalities that you've propped up under Korenizatsiya. How are you going to make sure the communists come out on top? Well, you say, well, local chauvinism isn't allowed either. And what we need to do is empower the communists who understand this to fight back. And then what you're going to do is you're going to help the people who are fighting against it, who are pushing the communist line, and you're going to slightly or more suppress the ethnic minorities who are not. So you're going to put a thumb on the scale to make sure that the communists come out on top. You're actually going to pick them, then the winners of that struggle, who will be the socialists and communists, to create your diversity in form and unity in content, and aka to implement and place these new minted ethnic minority socialists or Soviets through the Korenizatsiya programming, the diversity programming. So this is your DEI right here, right? What I just explained to you was from Stalin, right? And it was implemented by Mao straight from the textbook. What I'm telling you is that these communist programs are DEI. And I think it was even reading stuff from 100 years ago, it's extremely obvious that it's the same program, right? The basis of most of the actionable stuff that we've faced through woke Marxism actually comes from the Soviet Union. And it was actually a communist program from its very beginning that we imported, changed the words a little bit, fit it to our context more specifically, but only kind of barely, and then just deployed on our people. And we are almost as far into this program as the Soviets were when they finally wrapped it up as too damaging, as causing too much strife. And guess what? We're at almost that same point too. We're now starting to see studies and articles coming out saying, oh, it just causes all these problems. And what you're going to see likely then is some weird push from the left for some new kind of weird unity for, I don't know, climate change or something, because we're getting at that point where they're going to need something different than what they've used so far. Maybe that's a lot because we fought back, and I think it is, and I hope that it is. But DEI, social justice, equity, the whole program of woke identity politics and everything underneath it, all of the mechanisms that are still legal and happening in our corporations and hiring, in college admissions and management, etc. That's all a Soviet program, guys. It's a Soviet program that was used as a high priority initiative in the 1920s in the Soviet Union until it failed. And we've seen this, and like I said, it's like a baited hook. We have taken it and we've swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And now where we find ourselves is clawing our way out, struggling to claw our way out of Korenizatsiya, Western style. Western Korenizatsiya is a fancy Russian way to say DEI. And so the point of this podcast was to inform you. It was to educate you that the DEI programming the equity programming, the social justice programming is explicitly, undeniably, irrevocably, whatever you want to say, absolutely a Soviet communist program that was designed to achieve Soviet communist goals in a diverse federation of republics. And it had bad results there. It will have bad results and is having bad results here. But we should be acting very seriously differently toward DEI, knowing that it was a deliberate Soviet project, that it is a big chunk of Stalinist theory on what nations are and what nations should be being forced onto our country. And we should be extremely skeptical on the other side, the reaction side, which is that local chauvinism, where all of a sudden we're going to adopt the opposite, right? So we have this woke right problem. We have people saying, oh yeah, CRT is just anti-white racism, so we need to be proud to be white. We need to push pro-white this, pro-man that, pro-straight that, the whole thing. We're going to do identity politics backwards, pro-Christian straight white male. We're going to push identity politics backwards, proud to be white. It's anti-white racism, so we're going to be pro-white racism or whatever. And you need to be really skeptical of that, because that's that local chauvinism. And we just read through how Stalin decided to make use of that. And he knows the dialectics it's going to set up, and he knows the power that it's going to be able to achieve, to say nothing of how much he was able to talk about it when he... to say nothing about how much he was able to talk about it, to extract power, I should say, in the terms of the great Russian chauvinism that had to be smashed out. And so the left is going to gain power off of both the left deviation and the right deviation. And I think we need to be really, really thoughtful about how we deal with this. Genuine legal or juridical equality, and then kind of letting things be beyond that is really the ideal of the American system and free Western systems. And I think we need to push really hard for those, and to not fall into these identity politics or Korenizatsiya or reverse Korenizatsiya traps that are being pushed on us, or that we are likely to fall into. So a lot of food for thought. If you are looking at DEI in a whole new way now, that's good, and that was the goal. Thanks for listening.